Hi there. My name is Ethan Knight. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Gap Year Association, and today I get to talk to you with a different hat on, that as one of the co-chairs for the Standards and Accreditation Committee. At the Gap Year Association, a lot of the great work that we do is really founded around the idea of gap year standards. So the Gap Year Association, many years ago, about 8 or 9 years ago, registered and is the Standards Development Organization. That's the SDO, as recognized by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. The Standards Development Organization was initially set up under George Herbert Walker Bush as a way to recognize that each industry is probably best left to regulate itself for the most part. Otherwise, we have a bunch of folks who are regulating industries about which they know nothing. So we initially got registered and are the Standards Development Organization for the Gap Year Association and Gap Year Education. And fundamentally, what that means is we have to keep up to date a living set of standards. Ours are typically reviewed and renewed every 2 to 4 years. We're currently in our 2018 set of standards, and we expect to have our 2022 set of standards coming out in Q1 of 2022 for program providers. For the Gap Year Consultant standards, those will probably come out in Q3 of 2022 if everything is going according to plan. The other thing that we have to do in order to maintain our SDO is to make sure that each one of the sets of standards are arrived at from a broad representation of the field. So to do that, we enlist the support of the Standards and Accreditation Committee, which is an independent committee under the auspices of the Gap Year Association and currently helmed by 4 outstanding individuals as co-chairs and representing all sorts of program providers, gap year consultants, risk management experts, and individuals, all to yield what we hope will be the most sort of robust set of standards for gap year education in the country. The Gap Year Association standards were built back in 2014 as the initial stab. And the fundamental presumption around how they were built is that they are sort of an amalgam of a variety of other standards. So when they were first designed, they were designed with the Association for Experiential Education in mind, the Forum on Education in mind, NAFSA, outdoor education, international education, experiential education, even service learning entities, in order to make sure that what we were providing was the best that we literally could offer. And to this day, we've had many successful organizations go through our accreditation process. For program providers, it seems to be taking an average of about 8 months start to finish from the point that they initially submit their first application. That can take as long as 2.5 years. The fastest I've ever seen it done is 4 months. For gap year consultants, this process can typically take a lot less time. There's, rather than 65 pages and roughly 170 standards, it's closer to about 5 or 6 pages and around 40 standards. Not to say that they're any less robust, but they classify into larger categories, thus fewer standards for the consultants. To be effective in this work for gap year education as a standards development organization, we really sort of followed, a couple sort of core ideas for what makes an effective theory of practice. So if we're going to sort of create a set of standards that are ultimately meant to sort of preserve quality and to the most of our abilities uplift safety considerations in student education, ideally what we found is that sort of the majority of sort of critical incidents or those that are sort of the gravest statute, they happen by students falling in between a bunch of sort of specific cracks within standards. And for that reason, what we tend to do is take a sort of a shotgun approach to standards. So rather than trying to hit one standard with sort of one sort of solution or consideration or concern in mind, we try and hit multiple standards that all tend to uplift the same sort of genesis of that concern. So be it around student transportation issues and road safety, seat belts, road security, driver sort of and vehicle security, or some other version. It works best with it if it all sort of going the same direction, covered through a variety of different standards. We also try and include a 360 evaluation. So any program provider is required to share students, active students, those that have been in the last cohort or two, to complete a survey that GYA administers, so that they basically will say, hey, as a student, I did experience the orientation, and they did cover these things that they say that they did. That's one of the ways that we sort of have an effective theory of practice. Probably the last, and then arguably one of the more significant ways, is that we try and merge or sort of recognize that sort of the balance of student safety is best met when the organization's culture, that is the staff, its leadership, have a general sort of like standard risk management lens in these arenas. So call them a cultural asset. And then the other aspect is that of a policy asset. So I've seen great organizations succeed on one of those individually, but as a whole, when the two are working in concert, that's when the students' outcomes are best predicted and the outcomes are most reliably favorable. Those are some of the core theories of effective practice for the Gap Year Association. Probably the final one, because I already gave you a final one before, is in the arena of duty of care. It's pretty typical in the college environment, higher ed, for instance, to look at duty of care and say, well, the more that we know, the more we're obligated to respond. Thus, typically, higher ed tends to say we would prefer not to know as much and instead judge that you're an 18-year-old adult. You have all of the means to be sort of successful on your journey. And so therefore, we don't want to intercede too much. We don't want as much liability. And you're an adult. You can sort of fend for yourself and assert your own needs and advocate for yourself. Gap years, being at that younger age demographic, that transition most typically from high school to college, we tend to take a different approach with things in general there. So that's just simply to say that we would much prefer to front load as much student health, mental health, and other concerns as possible. And yes, that does put a higher duty of care for the program providers that are accredited to respond appropriately. But the general presumption here is that we're going to do better by the student because we are more in the know. The other thing that this also prevents is inevitably in any given cohort, if you're working with cohorts, you might expect to have one or two higher needs students of those that are sort of known and predicted. But when you have a cohort where 3/4 of the students are a higher need demographic, that tends to sort of tank the overall flow and sort of enjoyability outcomes for the whole cohort. So this is a way to say that front loading, we want to know better than most that if we are going to have some higher need students, we have the capability to work with them and the whole group at large. So those are some of the core effective sort of ideas for GYA's theory of effective practices. The process for accreditation for providers and consultants, you've seen me sort of stand on the screen here, but this is all standards and accreditation content. And one of the core things that we're trying to do here is communicate all of the ins and outs of what this is, how the process works, and sort of what it yields you. For program providers, as it is different for Gap Year consultants, we have two different things. We have an engagement letter. The engagements letter, the first place to start. Go ahead and download this. Whatever's from the website, it'll tell you the most current engagement letter that we have available. Different one for consultants as it is for program providers. This will spell out everything from timelines to costs to sort of a reasonable response times to sort of generally, outlining again some of our theories of effective practice and benefits. The other thing that the engagement letter does is it's an opportunity to outline some of the core things that you're always going to be committing to. So rather than putting in a standard that requires an evidentiary burden to say, yes, we will abide by the standards when not under a review year, we instead put that into the engagement letter that someone then has to sign as an authorized party from your organization. Now, as an engagement letter signee for a consultant, there's no special additional fee paid. That's a flat $300 fee for accredited consultants to start the process. And once you are hopefully successfully accredited, your annual dues just remain at $300. For Gap Year programs, instead, we do a different approach because this is a slightly more exhaustive pathway, 160 standards, 170 standards, as opposed to roughly 40. It tends to be a slightly different approach, 40 or 60, something in that vein. Gap Year programs will have to sign the accreditation and pay a $1,500 non-refundable deposit. That deposit gets banked by GYA, and effectively what that does is that gets you access to our online accreditation platform. The best way to access that is to, or see a view of that is if you go to YouTube. GYA has a great YouTube channel set up, and there's I think an 8 or 9 minute video that outlines just how the online application process works for Gap Year providers. So once they've signed the engagement letter, once they've actually paid the $1,500 deposit and get access to the online tool, And here it is on the next screen, I'm assuming. Once they get access to all this great information, then it's your window, yeah, right here, online accreditation application instructions. So this is available from GYA's YouTube channel. So once the gap year programs are paying that accreditation fee, then you get access to the online application. Our only rule is that every 6 months you have to be advancing your application. So what that means is you pay the application deposit, you then have 6 months to complete and submit your application. GYA will then take it in and review. That typically takes about 2 months from the point that you've submitted it to GYA's first review. We tend to do this in rounds, round 1, round 2, round 3. It's not uncommon for an initial round to show of 160 standards, you might have 40 to 50 that are showing investigate, which just means we have further questions about it, and the balance, hopefully successfully, you've already navigated. So the program provider, you pay the $1,500, get access to the online tool, and then once you submit it, we'll read it, give you back comments, typically within 2 months, and then you'll have another 6 months to think through your rebuttals, think through your responses, maybe add, edit, or create new evidential materials that will demonstrate that you're meeting the standard, and then submit it back to us. We recognize that when programs are in program mode, the core sort of focus needs to be on students and families, on programs, logistics, safety, all of those outcomes that are so critical to the good work that we do. So we didn't want to sort of create arbitrary timelines that were unfortunately quite limiting. Instead, gave you those 6 months. As long as you're nurturing that back and forth for 6 months, you are not currently paying member dues. That may change in the near future, but for now, when you have paid your accreditation application fee, wherever you are, either as a renewal or initially starting as a member, you will stay in that current bucket until you have finalized your accreditation, and no new additional member dues for your annual dues are required. Only once you've completed your accreditation, hopefully, and are successful, will you pay another $1,500 deposit. And at that point, we'll make an announcement, do a newsletter blast, and then your accreditation is good for 4 years at that point. We say 4 years, that means at the end of those 4 years, we expect a new accreditation engagement letter and deposit. So effectively 4 years is turning into 5. It's 4 years is the trigger for the next event. And we expect that that's going to take on average 8 months to a year, start to finish, for that accreditation. There's another aspect to this, which is a 2-year, we call it a soft study. Another way to think of that is an accreditation light. The soft study, the way that that's designed to be done is that you basically just go through and fill out the actual application as a PDF. We're not going to ask you to go through and provide evidence, although we may request evidence for as many as 6 or so specific standards. But the idea here is to recognize that you may have created standards as policy in order to meet GYA accreditation, and you want to both see that that's become part of your culture, initially to part of that sort of the theory of effective practice. So what was a policy we want to see actually integrated into your day-to-day mechanics. The other reason why we do the 2-year self-study is to recognize that every 4 years, every 2 years, there might be a new set of standards coming out. And we don't want to see you fall 2 whole iterations behind by the time you have to reaccredit, because a lot does change within each set of standards. We want to make sure that we're staying abreast of whatever the best and brightest our committee has to offer, in essence, inevitably to preserve students' safety and outcomes. So before diving in any farther, you can start to see here's the actual GYA sets of standards for programs. I'm going to go back and show you the consultants. It looks slightly different, and that's by design. Currently, the standards for consultants are not done through an online platform, but rather done through PDF, where the consultant applicant would fill out the information in the PDF and then reference materials as attached either through an email or through Google Drive, Dropbox, some other sort of file sharing software. For providers, the process is very online. Because you're going to be looking at that, the YouTube channel, I'm not going to spend your time sort of running you through that. There's a separate video for that. However, I did think it was worth the time to highlight a couple of the most common standards that people have struggles with. Either they misunderstand them or otherwise don't know how to provide evidence for them. There's a handful of these. They won't take too long, but if you got what you want out of this video, then go ahead and shut it off. Otherwise, if you want to get a little bit into the weeds of some of the core standards, this may be a helpful next 10 minutes or so. So broadly speaking, GYA, the sets of standards are divided into 5 core categories. Every organization must complete philosophy and professional ethics. This is just fundamental to how gap years are done. The next, 2.x.x, these are service learning. So any organization that's sort of facilitating a service learning activity for their students, be it in a developing country or here in the US, especially with consideration for power differentials, we're going to ask you to complete the service learning standards. If there is no service learning standards in your program and none in the foreseeable future, then you do not need to complete 2.x.x. You can skip them. 3.x.x, that's backcountry, developing country. We're going to, in the next set of standards, this is called sort of remote or far away places, something to that effect. And that's recognizing any organization where students are 2 hours away from definitive medical care. Fundamentally, that means, can you get an appendectomy at 4 o'clock in the morning, or do you get to the clinic has no one there from 12 a.m. until 9 a.m. and so you're left waiting for an appendectomy? That does not count. In that case, you would have to complete the backcountry or developing country standards. This is fundamentally a way to presume that if you are further away from resources, from risk management, emergency services, then more proactive training is required in order to minimize your exposure in those environments. 4.x.x, this is currently called independent student placements. We're shifting the language away from placements towards experiences to recognize that placements have more of a hierarchical sort of transactional quality. And what we're inevitably hoping for the students is to have an authentic experience. In this case, an independent student experience is something where a student may not have an organizational staff person with them from the GYA member organization. You might not actually see that student except once every 3 weeks. That's the GYA threshold to still be able to meet the standard and call it a facilitated experience. That supervisor could be an internship mentor. It could be a job supervisor. It could be a virtual mentor from the home and organization, or it even could be an in-person site visit. Any of those would work. Part of the value of the Gap Year Association standards is that they're not a one-size-fits-all. They really recognize the genius and sort of diversity of program opportunities that are out there for young people to avail themselves of on a quality gap year. Last but not least is 5.x.x. That's fundamentally partnerships. And that's a way of saying if you're outsourcing any of the core program sort of components, you cannot outsource risk management. You still have to be an invested party. No kidding. But it made sense to put this into a set of standards. So this is anything to do with homestays, transportation subcontractors, outdoor adventure outfitters, whitewater rafting, hiking guides, zipline instructors. Any of those kinds of environments would be in the partnerships arena. Moving on, the main standards, so 1.1s, all of the 1.1s, these are broadly speaking how we define what a gap year is. You'll notice the first 3 are rooted in some form of experiential education, and all of the GYA standards have to be evidentiarily supported. I cannot emphasize this enough. This is one of the most common areas that applicants fall a little bit flat, is they might say, yes, we do that, and expect that to pass muster. That does not pass muster with GYA. We need proof. We need evidence. This is a 360 objective eval, and that means that sort of we take your word for it. We need to see it, and we're going to ask the students about it. One of my favorite sayings is trust in God, but tie your camel too. This is a great way to follow that rubric. 1.1.1, appropriate mentorship that is defined by the organization. That's to say that mentorship happens at every level of experiential education, where the core problems of experiential learning is that if it's not done well, Students might draw incorrect conclusions from partial information. A good mentor will continue to layer in additional educational information, experiences, reflections, insights, so that the student walks away with a more holistic understanding of what's actually afoot, rather than a misunderstood basis of their limited perception. 1.1.2, focused reflection with strong emphasis on student-directed answers. Reflection is a critical component of a proper experiential education environment, experiential learning. And it's fundamentally a way to say that nothing is real until you're grappling with it. So we want to make sure that students are actively reflecting. And frankly, GYA does not care how that takes place, whether it's a photo documentary, whether it's journal prompts, whether it's group discussions, whether it's a video in a documentary that you actually make. GYA really doesn't care. It could be a paper for all that matter if you have students that are particularly academically inclined, but it has to be reflected with a strong emphasis on student-directed answers. It's to say that if we're giving them all the information and that's consumptive, that's not experiential. And we want to make this a fundamentally experiential, gosh, I hate doing this, fundamentally experiential experience. I apologize for that. The 1.1.3, students have an active role in the governance. This is fundamentally a way to say that it's been my experience as an educator that when things go wrong and we as staff are doing all of the stuff for them, inevitably they stand back and say, well, gosh, that didn't work well. I hope you learned a lesson. I didn't, because I didn't really have any skin in the game. And this is a way of saying we want the students to have skin in the game so that the natural consequences actually happen. You've heard the saying, perhaps we remember 90% of what we say and 10% of what we hear. I guess I should say that 9 more times, huh? But we remember 90% of what we say and 10% of what we hear. And this is fundamentally a way to lean into that adage for student learning. 1.1.4, student is set up for success. This is all about pushing comfort zones. Students learn the most when they're on the edge of what's comfortable. Comfort zone, learning zone, panic zone. A good gap year will oscillate between all three, because if you live in the learning zone, it can become the comfort zone. So it's a very important way to say that we want learning to be paramount, but learning happens in a variety of ways, both known and unknown to us. So we want them to be everything from cultural to personal to academic to career to global citizen and human oriented, social. All of these are outcomes that we're after in a gap year. 1.1.5, exposing students to and discussing with them differing worldviews. If a student walks out of a gap year saying, my perspective is the one, only, and true, and everybody else is wrong, that runs counter to the ethos of the gap year, which is it's more human oriented to say that we live in a more interdependent world than we ever have before, and that's provided a lot of strengths and some weaknesses, but we will all rise or fall together, because on some issues, climate change being a great one, we are all in this together. So it's better, we're going to get farther in life if we do it in community, and that's fundamentally what that's presuming. Last but not least it's a bit of a sort of a diversity or an equity and inclusion goal. It's not to say that GYA wants everybody to admit every student across every spectrum, but we want you to be transparent about it, and we want you to be bullish about an inclusive environment. Gap years are accessible to every student. That doesn't mean that every student can do every program, but there are great options for every student, and we want to make sure that that's highlighted. Gap years are accessible. That's a large part of what 1.1.6 goes after. A quick point for all of the 1.2s, all of the 1.2s have to be publicly available prior to the point of application. This is about helping families know and judge what's a good fit. This is about helping families, especially those that come from lower income backgrounds, not get a week into a process only to realize that it's not a good fit for them. So we want to make sure that students and families and consultants have what they need to judge the right fit, to judge, do we keep going on the application process, potentially with an application fee, sunk time, disappointment if they're not eligible, all of these things. It's all an attempt to front load transparently everything a family needs to know if this is a good fit. All right. 1.3.5. Again, I'm just highlighting some of the most confusing ones. Organization has independent medical expertise available on call for consultation. Typically, when we're seeing an organization apply with this standard, what we want to see is an agreement, potentially a retainer agreement, but it has to outline minimum certification levels, right? So if there is a live certification, we expect that you're going to maintain that, whatever that is that you agree with your organization, according to GYA, a minimum of an RN or higher certification. We also want to see in that letter or agreement the recognition of what on call means. To GYA, on call means returning a call within 24 hours. And we want to see, hopefully less than 24, but 24 is the outset for GYA. And last but not least is if there is some person who's going to sort of take a vacation, right? We want to make sure that that's written into the agreement, that that person knows the expectation is on them to find a replacement. In essence, being on call is great, but even those of us on call need to take a break from time to time. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't leave the program or any students over, up the creek, should sort of you leave and not have access to that person or that expertise. Oftentimes organizations do this either by having a board member who has that expertise and is willing to volunteer that service. Other times I've seen organizations pay for a higher order of organizational insurance for commercial, general commercial, that includes that. Alternatively, other organizations will hire someone and pay them on retainer. There's many solutions to this. 1.3.6, this is another very common one. It's the same idea, except instead of from a medical, physical health perspective, it's from a mental health perspective. In both of these cases, we want you as an organization to have your own organizational sort of like relationships here. If you ask for the student's clinician to sort of triage, unfortunately for the organization and the rest of the students and the staff, that student's clinician, their primary goal and their client is the student. So they're always going to advocate for the student regardless of what's good for everybody else. And so in this way, we want to make sure that you as the organization have the expertise available to hopefully succeed in keeping students on program when they struggle by getting expertise and advice along the way. And at the very least, we want to make sure that that clinician knows what they have to do in order to support all of the parties involved, right? If you have one student acting for themselves and nobody's looking out for the rest of the cohort or the program, then inevitably those problems start to stack and we find ourselves in some pretty challenging solutions pretty quickly. Similar for the MD, we want to see the exact same three things written into an agreement for a clinician. And it is noteworthy, GYA does not require a minimum level of certification, just that you have to, as the program, knowing what your needs are, where you're located, and what your risk profile looks like, that you know what those certifications are and clearly communicate them to the parties involved. That's the students, your staff, and how to, of course, avail themselves of these resources. There's two different approaches to this, but one of the things that I would oftentimes highlight is leaning on a locally trained clinician, say in even New Zealand or Uganda, for instance. They might have great clinicians there, but if your student population are from the US, and they are now moving into a clinical setting with someone who was trained according to radically different circumstances, that student will suffer and probably not sort of be able to sort of like turn the tide towards their own improvement. We strongly encourage and generally, pretty close to require having that clinician be trained according to Western modalities. In higher education, they've leaned into this, and frequently the most esteemed higher education institutions will actually hire a US trained clinician and pay for them their salary and their cost of living overseas in order to be that on call, purely recognizing that divide I just referenced. The two ways that organizations will meet this one is usually with a retainer in mind. There's a couple great companies out there that do it, but that retainer will vary sometimes in terms of whether they are allowed or willing to speak directly to the student, because there are clinical implications to practicing outside of your state, or practicing through a virtual format that may or may not be recording the call, versus sort of initial assessment and diagnosis. So some clinicians will say, we won't talk to the students, we will only talk to the staff, and that's purely up to the organization to decide where their comfort level is. Let's see, 1.4.1. This is another common or confusion. This is fundamentally around FERPA and HIPAA. Generally speaking, most GYA members are not required to abide by HIPAA and FERPA in the strictest sense of the law, but we want to abide by them for sort of, at least ethically, for two core reasons. One is it's part of where we're going with higher education. Colleges, in order to be sort of, trustworthy, notable partners, they need to see that we hold this stuff sincerely. So that's partially why it's there. The other reason is the core underlying rationale for each of these is to allow the student to have their own independent experience. So if a student comes from a particularly conservative or overly liberal background, and they're sort of running into different points of view, different worldviews, and themselves changing their own point of perspective, the student should be free to come to that truth for themselves, outside of the influences and pressures of their parents and other sort of people from life back home. The idea is this experience is for the student. It is not the parents to be a helicopter on. This is the student's experience, and we want to uplift that as much as possible. A couple scenarios where this might come out is if a student potentially, was afraid that they had a pregnancy scare. Do you share that with the parents? Another common intersection here is if a student gets sent home for a policy violation. At what point do you share that the policies have been violated and it's up to the student to communicate that to the parent? And at what point do you now have to communicate certain things to the parent? Generally, GYA wants to see that happen only with previous consent from the student directly, preferably in writing, but understanding that can't always take place. But we want to make sure that the student's included in it, or at the very least, that you're not sharing these details unless students are immediately threatened with safety to life and limb, obviously, right? 1.5.1. This is the crux of every on-site orientation. In this particular standard, we outlined that orientation has to start and finish within 96 hours of the beginning of the program, and it has to be on-site in person. That means it can't be done virtually or remote. You can have some of these components done virtually or remotely, but there has to be an on-site orientation that covers all of these 5 core components. The reason being that if you talk to a student about sort of navigating traffic in a busy Calcutta intersection on a virtual environment, they might understand sort of the images of it, but they won't understand viscerally what that is. And it's important that they do, because they're putting themselves in harm's way. So the on-site nature of this adds to the gravity and hopefully the educational safety that we're trying to create, so students themselves are their best sort of risk manager, but with the training and overlaid support of the local staff there and other peer cohorts. 1.6. All of the 1.6s are focused on transportation. I cannot emphasize this enough, especially if you're in the developing world, but even in the US, that is one of the most common, if not, I'm sure it is the most common sort of fatality incident happen in transportation. So we spend a fair bit of time in this, and strongly encourage that every organization create some sort of template or checklist prior to every departure, so that all of the core things that you forget to do by the 10th or 11th time all happen. Transportation, you will never find a time typically when you're more exposed than when you're doing transportation. 1.7.7, this is a real common one. Post-program interaction. Yes, we're talking about social media, but we're also talking about going to the bar at the end of the program, or is it okay to have a drink with a student if the student's staying at the end of the program on site, not flying home, say, and the staff are there? What's the staff's obligation at that point? Because according to the students have lived with this staff person as their life safety person for weeks, if not months, if not a year. And because a day has switched, you can't just assume that the students will change that relationship. So this is a way to say, we want it to be clearly written and understood for all parties involved. If you're flying home and a student gets hammered, drunk, because it's an international flight, who's responsible for that student? It's happened to me, and that's partially why the standard is here. Think about that with marijuana, with alcohol, with any of the sort of the challenging moral things. If a student's there, we want to make sure that you think through it in advance. 1.8.14. This is fundamentally to say staff are educated, proficient, and trained in how to work with students on prescription psychotropics. That's antidepressants, that's bipolar medicine, that's ADD, ADHD, any of these. Partially, these are drugs that have a sort of a stimulant quality. It's not unheard of for students to be passing this stuff around on program. Fundamentally, what's under this assumption is to say, however, that most staff, when you're in the field managing logistics, student dynamics, behavioral health, curricula, all of these things, that's a 2 full-time job already. And when you add mental health and clinical health sort of and the specifics around each student's medication, the contraindications, the risk factors, and the sort of the risk modalities, the things that are presenting as risky behavior, that's way too much to train on top of all this other stuff that they have to manage. So generally, GYA's suggestion here is to create a list of red flag behaviors that you train your staff at during training so that they can know when to proactively, before it becomes big, uplift that student and your concerns to your headquarters, who can then tap into that clinician for the available expertise back in the 1.3.6 standard. That's largely our best suggestion. Some organizations have gone about trying to train each staff person on all of the known students' medications, and yes, that's doable. I'd say it's arguably a lot more challenging to do well than training people on sort of what are the behaviors that you should be concerned about so that they can uplift them to the next order of staff. 1.8.16, this is a big one, epinephrine. GYA's current approach is to say we cannot require that every organization have Epi, because technically in the US it is illegal to administer or acquire a prescription for epinephrine unless it's directly for the student and to the student, the individual who's going to be using it. The reality is, in a backcountry environment, you might be an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours from definitive medical care and be exposed to a new allergen for the first time in your life, right? That's definitely what happens on a gap year, right? You're going to places you've never been before. I've heard of students going to Uganda, never had a mango before, and have an allergic reaction, anaphylaxis. Even internal to the standards committee, we recently had a committee member who was running a marathon, got stung by a bee, first time ever having gotten stung by a bee and getting an anaphylactic reaction, right? Bee stings can progressively get more and more sort of severe in their exposure. And now this person carries around an EpiPen, but after they did have to get evacuated to a hospital and spend some time there and probably spend a lot of money. So GYA's general suggestion on this front is, if you can and you're comfortable with it, get Epi. The cost to not doing it is 6 minutes or less and fatalities. I've seen data that says in anywhere between 20 to 40% of the time, students will need a second epinephrine injection. And specifically, we want to make sure that you are training your staff on how to administer epinephrine. So that could be a training module, that could be a virtual course you require all of your staff to do. Typically, it's Epipens, and don't get me wrong, it's very easy to think that an EpiPen is a no-brainer, easy thing to do. The reality is, an EpiPen, it's very easy to get wrong. And partially the presumption for why that 20 to 40% re-administration is required is because when you're in a panic, you do it at an angle, you don't do it hard enough, or you don't press it down and wait the full time that the medication is not properly administered. And so we want to make sure that this is part of your overall risk management profile. Epi is just one of those things that sort of the cost to not having it is so grave, and the cost to administering it improperly is typically so sort of relatively less, that it tends to be most organizations' protocol is to have it on hand. GYA suggests that in the case, if you're struggling with the legalities of that, GYA instead suggests asking any student with a known allergy to bring a minimum of 2, preferably 3 EpiPens for program. One that stays on them at all time. right? Ideally, you'd like to trust that the student's going to have their own med kit with them at all time, but let's not be foolhardy and assume that. A second EpiPen will go in the organization's med kit, just in case that student needs it, or in case a student with an unknown previous medical anaphylactic reaction should require an EpiPen, then you have one there at the very least to support, right? Are you going to tell me that you're not going to administer it and watch a student die? Probably not. Just administer it. In most cases, that's what most organizations will do. Yeah, those are the big ones. That third pen, you can either have a second one at a headquarters, a second one in the med kit, or an extra one in the headquarters, or ask the student to bring to have two on them at all times. But oftentimes, getting epinephrine in developing countries that's reliably good, meaning it's properly been refrigerated, it's a known entity, the pens are all administered correctly. Sometimes that can be a challenge depending on where you are in the world. We generally suggest bringing it from the U.S. for the medication's integrity. And last but not least, 1.10.4. This is focused on 12 months of therapy. So anytime a student has been to a clinician in the previous 12 months, we want to see a communication plan between them. Generally speaking, what that means from GYA's perspective is it's not to say that we expect the clinician to spend an hour for free and do the full download. Frankly, that's a little bit inappropriate to expect. We do ideally want to see get the pre-approval, talk it out with the clinician and make sure that they approve of the student going on the program. Our main consideration, though, because many organizations won't do that, the time and the returns are sometimes arguable. Instead, what they'll do is they'll say, hey, let's just create a communication plan. I want the student to sign a release of information form so that if something happens in the field, we at headquarters from the program can talk to that student's clinician without the student being on the line and get some direct access to potentially critical information without the clinician holding their hand up and saying, I can't release that information. I know that you say it's a problem and that there's an urgency to it, but I can't release that information because I don't know who you are. I don't have a relationship with you, and I don't have a released waiver to actually disclose any personal information for the student. So this is a way to preload that so that before the student's in the middle of the Serengeti and you need to get the release of information, and communication and faxing is really hard, no delays should be required. We just want to get to the life safety critical information first. And then finally, 1.10.5, medications. A lot of students are showing up more and more so with some form of medication on program. Great, more power to them. We typically want to see that each organization is deliberate about that. And so whether your organization holds the medication and doles it out to students with a record book, or whether your organization requires the students to be self-sufficient in their medication administration, that's up to you as a program and your essential eligibility criteria. More than anything, we want to just see that students are prepared, because most students who are taking a gap year have never traveled before. If a student misses their antidepressant, or it gets ruined or lost in transit and they don't have it, student suicide rates and sort of long-term outcomes drop off precipitously, especially with an unpredicted medication adjustment. And if a student loses their antidepressants and they get to another country, a lot of the US antidepressants are not available in other countries. So now we're dealing with shipping a medication across as a controlled substance across international lines with unknown delays, unknown sort of fees, unknown briberies that are required, and who knows if the pharmacy is even willing to send it over an international boundary. That's a lot of question marks when a student's sort of mental health may be on the line in a pretty severe way. So this is fundamentally a way of saying we want to front load that conversation, because most students who are taking a gap year have never traveled before. They don't think about having my medication get stolen in my day bag, because I've never been in a place where my day bag could get stolen in that way. Or damaged because it gets wet or rained on, right? You might want to split the meds, have some in your check-on and some in your day kit, in your day bag. How do you carry it to make sure that if someone does pull you over from customs and immigration, it doesn't just look like you're trafficking drugs, but you've got your prescription and the details and your name and all of the numbers on there. So anyway, that's it. There's a lot more to the standards, obviously, as you can see. The next set of standards will be coming out very shortly. And we are really thrilled to have you on this call. I hope this has been a helpful short session. 45 minutes isn't quite short, so hopefully I've made it somewhat entertaining. But at the very least, I hope to see you at the conference, and thanks for watching.